Alrighty, so we're picking up now with officially Unit 1. And some of you who are more astute may recognize that this is the last slide that we did from Unit 0, the prologue unit. And I just wanted to start here as sort of just a quick refresher. Um, we went through this whole process of basically dissecting the fact that the original intent of the founders of our nation was that slavery would gradually die out, and within a generation or so of the Constitution's adoption, would essentially be dead. So, even in the longest term prognosis we would be looking at, by the 1830s or 40s, 1850 at the latest, slavery would be gone in America. And they basically just left it at that to avoid conflict and to sort of let things gradually and naturally progress. To the point that the Constitution itself, at no point in time ever directly mentions the word slavery, and it really wasn't. It really wasn't put in there at all to, you know, it, it was an acknowledgement of the fact that the founders realized that slaves were human beings, and this whole concept of them being subhuman didn't even exist in their minds. Now, if we look at the economic principle number 6, sometimes people's actions have unintended consequences. Sometimes choices have unintended consequences. This was the case with the cotton gin, an invention by a well-meaning entrepreneur named Eli Whitney, who genuinely thought that it would hasten the end of slavery. And it did the exact opposite. And what ended up happening was that the profitability of cotton and the perceived necessity of slavery for that cotton created a divide between two parts of the country, the North and the South. And it was during this time period, say maybe the 1820s to the 1840s and 50s, that the southern states, particularly intellectuals in the southern states, wealthy intellectuals, people who were educated and smart, began justifying slavery through a combination of scientific observation and religion. And this is where the idea that slaves not being fully human or people, and that it was actually in their best interest because they couldn't, they wouldn't be able to survive on their own, this kind of nonsense developed. Abraham Lincoln, who initially was not an abolitionist, really. In fact, I'm sure most of you are aware that he actually represented a slave owner when he was a lawyer in Illinois. Abraham Lincoln really became of the opinion that the original goal of the founders, that slavery was meant to die out, needed to be realized. And this is sort of what he was. Sorry, I had to pause there for a second. So it really got to the point that when Lincoln pursued a political career, whether it was in the form of running for representative or especially in his Senate run against Stephen Douglas the first time, and then into his presidential run, he really made it his goal to sort of get back to this idea that slavery needed to be limited and eventually it would die off somehow or another. A war became necessary to do it. And the war was fought to preserve the Union and the Constitution and to be able to restore the vision of the founders. And during the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, officially ending slavery in the states that had rebelled. And this moves us into the era of the Reconstruction, where Lincoln's ideas were going to be put into practice to rebuild America as the founders had envisioned and intended. Now, let's look real quick at this picture here, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to examine a primary source from the time period. So this is a political cartoon that shows these two individuals, Uncle Abe and Andy. And Andy says, "Take it quietly, Uncle Abe, and I will draw it closer than ever. A few more stitches, Andy, and the good old Union will be mended." And it's a giant ball here with the country that Andy is putting back together with a needle and a thread. And over here, Lincoln is using a split rail fence piece to put this together. Now, some contextual observations about this cartoon. First of all, obviously the two people in the picture are Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. And what's going on in the picture? Well, first of all, the caption, "The rail splitter at work repairing the Union." Lincoln, at one time before he got into politics, had had many jobs, including the stories of him as a builder and being a frontiersman, making split rail fences where you would cut the beams and then insert them and piece them together to make a fence. This is where the reference of rail splitter comes from. Andrew Johnson, up here with the needle and the thread, the audience of the time would have understood this as a reference to the fact that Johnson had been a tailor before entering into politics. So what you have are two men with very humble beginnings who are coming together to put back into one piece the country that has suffered so much because of the war. Now, a couple of little points to understand about this. We know that this cartoon had to be somewhere in the newspaper in the time period between, say, late November of 1864 to very early April of 1865. Why do we know it's that particular time period? Because it's not anywhere on here. We can actually understand this just by looking and picking out a few certain clues. Number one, it has to be before the official end of the war because Lincoln was dead before the war ended. And being alive in this picture, this is obviously before the war ended then because Lincoln's still here. Also, Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's second vice president. Lincoln's president during his first term was Hannibal Hamlin. So the fact that Johnson is here really does indicate that this has to be after the election victory of 1864, which would have been in early November. And Lincoln was assassinated in early April. Ergo, it's got to be between late November, when the election results would have been finalized, and early April, when Lincoln was assassinated. Aside from the activity of piecing through this and deciphering what we can know about it, this political cartoon is very upbeat. It really is incredibly optimistic. It has a sense of hope to it. That hope is shattered by the reality of Lincoln's assassination. And that's what it is that I want to jump into right now. Let's talk about that. So let's look at some basic surface level events of the war. Okay. Whoops. Popped it off there. Let's look quickly in the South. The South's entire economy had been devastated by the war. What little industry it had was wiped out, whether it was through siege or through deliberate destruction, like in Sherman's March to the Sea or Sheridan's Shenandoah campaigns. The Southern industry was destroyed. The farmlands were basically empty. What little food may have been there was raided either by pillaging Union armies or um, wiped out during a scorched earth policy, or you know, unplanted because there was nobody there to do it. And without growing stuff, you can't feed people. You also can't support trade in an economy, especially an economy based on agriculture. Railroad lines were destroyed. The railroad lines that the South had before the war weren't anything to speak of, anyways, because no two states had the same rail gauge. So if you wanted to transport, say, food from Texas into, you know, Mississippi or Arkansas, you literally had to stop at the border, unload all the train cars, and load them onto a brand new train in the new state because the trains could not go from one state to another. Cities were destroyed. The war had wreaked havoc on the southern urban areas. The big cities, Richmond, Atlanta, Vicksburg, were completely ruined. There was no money coming into the South at all. No bankers or businessmen or investors were putting money into the South. No foreign countries were putting money into the South. There was no government money coming in. There was no money being put in the South and its economy. And the South's own money, which it had printed during the war, was utterly useless. It was essentially papel higienico at this point in time. South's agriculture was wiped out. The plantation system was no more. What crops may have been there, with the gradual victory of Union forces in the South and the mass exodus of slaves off these plantations, there was nowhere to harvest these foods. And in many cases, when the new planting season rolled around, there was nobody to do that because there were no more workers. The slaves were gone, and the white people were either in the army or busy doing something else. And the casualty rates for the South were in the hundreds of thousands of killed and wounded. And what do you do all of a sudden with 4 to 6 million people who had not been free beforehand? The former slaves are now just sort of milling about in the South with no jobs, no education, no money, no prospects whatsoever. Now, in the North, you don't have this level of hardship, but what you have is almost 20 years of control on the part of one political party whose only real unifying principle was the abolition of slavery. But then they achieve that, like, right away. And now what do you do? Well, here's the thing. Remember that the Republican Party was formed in Ripon, Wisconsin in the 1850s, specifically as an abolitionist party. The thing we have to keep in mind is that not all abolitionists wanted to get rid of slavery for the same reasons. Not all of them had the same ideas. And now that the war is done and slavery is officially over, what the heck do you do? And there's not a lot of agreement necessarily. This government passed the Homestead Act of 1863. The Homestead Act, which encouraged people to move to the West and to build on this idea of manifest destiny, this concept that America was destined to stretch from sea to shining sea, from coast to coast, from Atlantic to Pacific. This was actually an abolitionist push. Now, why would I say that? What does it have to do with slavery? Those new states in the West would not be slave states. And what the Republicans were trying to do was increase the majority of the non-slave states so that when laws were made, those laws would curtail slavery. The National Banking Act, an attempt to reestablish a central bank for the United States. It did not work, but it had some really interesting unintended consequences for the American economy, which we'll talk a little bit about later on as we get into 1876. The Freedmen's Bureau. You know, again, the law of unintended consequences here. The Freedmen's Bureau was started with the best of intentions. It was going to be a government program to help former slaves, provide them with education, job training, basic necessities. What it ended up turning into was sort of a black pit where money disappeared. And in the darkness of the pit, nobody knew what the heck was going on. I mean, it was full of government corruption and really a distinct lack of accountability. And in the end, it did nothing except line the pockets of some very unscrupulous and not very well meaning people. While all the rest of this is going on, you have a seemingly bizarre, unrelated event, but it does feed into the bigger picture. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia. Now, we're only a couple of years removed from the Civil War at this point. The country is devastated. Our economy is in shambles. Half the country can't feed itself. And we plop down something like $7 million in gold and buy Alaska from Russia at a time when we really couldn't afford to do it. The time that that purchase happened, it was referred to as Seward's Folly. William Seward was the Secretary of State for Andrew Johnson. And by the way, this is one of the few things that I will give Andrew Johnson props for actually achieving in his presidency. We bought Alaska. We ended up paying something like 2 cents an acre for Alaska. Everybody's, you spend so much money in Alaska, there's nothing up there but like Russian Orthodox missionaries and some Eskimos and random polar bears and walruses and other caribou and reindeer and stuff. What good is that? Well, first of all, hundreds of millions of acres of trees, which at a time when wood was the primary building material for the Navy, as well as a necessary commodity for railroad expansion and for people on the plains and stuff like that, that wood was valuable. But 30 years down the road, more specifically, in 1896, when gold's discovered in Alaska, it suddenly becomes a great bargain that we bought it. And then in the 20th century, when oil was discovered, Alaska became an even bigger bargain. It is a treasure trove of resources that we literally paid pennies on the acre for. Seward's Folly, a good investment in the long term. In 1869, in Promontory, Utah, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads met up, driving a golden spike into the ground and linking the East Coast to the West Coast, so that it was now possible to get on a train in New York City and take it all the way across the country and end up in San Francisco like 3 weeks later. That was a huge, huge jump forward. It also brought with it a boatload of problems on a variety of levels regarding corruption and a lot of shady political dealings, which we'll talk about also. The Transcontinental Railroad was primarily the work of two groups of immigrants, the Irish and the Chinese, two very, very different groups of immigrants. However, those two groups of immigrants and the way that they ended up in America kind of brings a new twist to the abolitionist movement, and we'll talk about that as well. In 1868, Andrew Johnson has the ignominious distinction of becoming the first president to be impeached. Now, in the interest of fairness, Andrew Johnson was a horrible president. He is generally ranked in the top or the bottom, like third or quarter or 20%, sometimes even in the bottom 5 of American presidents. He was a complete jerk. He was a bigot and kind of a bully. Now, with all that being said, he did nothing to be impeached. Impeachment really needs to be a serious charge, and politically motivated impeachment, which the impeachment of Johnson was, is a horrible thing to do. It set up a really bad precedent that was so bad that for over 100 years, nobody would even whisper impeachment until Richard Nixon actually did stuff that was bad enough to be impeached, and he resigned before being impeached. By the way, just a little aside for you, there have been 3 presidents who have been impeached. Johnson was the first, Bill Clinton was the second, and Donald Trump was actually impeached twice, which is its own record. Of the 3 of them, Johnson's and Trump's probably are primarily politically motivated. Bill Clinton's had a lot of substance behind the impeachment that was somehow worked through in a backwoods negotiation or a backroom negotiation that to this day I still don't fully understand. And I have talked to former government officials who actually had been involved in the impeachment, who privately say that there is no way he should not have been found guilty and removed, or at least punished. But the party bosses made some kind of an agreement in his case. But in any case, I go back to the impeachment of Johnson, who was a complete jerk. Being a complete jerk is not grounds enough for impeachment. You actually got to commit serious crime. But that leads us in the election of 1868, where we elect a worse president than Andrew Johnson, and that is the form of Ulysses S. Grant, war hero, winning general of the Civil War, and absolutely useless president who somehow got himself reelected and probably could have gotten a 3rd term had his party not come to their senses and realized that it would have been horrible for the country. Grant is usually regarded in the bottom 5 of U.S. presidents. His presidency is just an awful mess. And again, we'll talk about that, but it's riddled with corruption, Grant's own ineptitude, and he also, by the way, just single-handedly caused the worst financial crisis of the 19th century. That's pretty epic when you can ruin an entire economy by yourself, basically. And the last thing here, a growing conflict between the federal government and the states over the issue of immigration. Prior to the Civil War, states pretty much set their own immigration policies. It's only after the war is over that the federal government really steps in and through court action is determined that the federal government, the government in Washington, are really the ones who have the power over immigration restrictions. And at its heart is a disagreement over the nature of European versus Asian immigration. And more distinctly, it leads to the passage of something called the Page Act, which is targeting Chinese immigrants because there was an argument put forward, and not necessarily an incorrect one, that Chinese immigrants who were basically coming to America as a new form of indentured servants, that they weren't called indentured servants, they were called contract immigrants, were basically being purchased from China and put into manual labor until that purchase was paid off. And this became a new rallying cry for the former abolitionist Republicans. Yes, some of the Page Act is definitely motivated by them people look different than us and we don't want them kind in our country. But there is a genuine level there where people thought that they were stopping a new form of slavery. So tomorrow we're going to pick up with a brief examination of the events that sort of highlight. This is an overview. We'll pick up a few of the events that highlight Reconstruction, and then we'll jump into the big year of 1876. Peace and love.